East Jersey State Prison, Rahway, New Jersey. Its massive copper dome tops a crumbling fortress and casts a foreboding gaze on the world outside.
Once you come up and the door slam, you say, oh, that's it. That's the end of the line, because there's no guarantees you're going to get out.
When it opened 100 years ago, it was hailed as a house of refuge, a reformatory for a growing number of youthful offenders. Over time, the idealism gave way to reality, and East Jersey became a holding pen for the toughest criminals in the state.
Committed a murder during the course of an armed robbery, and which made it a felony murder, thus, life in prison.
You've got several hundred inmates who are serving life sentences with no parole. You've got about 500 that are doing at least 20 years without parole eligibility.
This place has been the scene of bloody riots.
I couldn't get out here any longer. There was too many inmates out here that were looking for hostages.
And intense violence.
The officer must have said something to him. He turned around, slashed his throat.
And let me tell you, when you die in a prison, it's not like everybody runs to assist you, right?
But despite the problems, East Jersey also is known for noteworthy inmates and contributions to society and popular culture. Middleweight boxer Reuben Hurricane Carter served time here for a crime many knew he did not commit. The singing group, the Escorts, recorded their first hit record while they were locked inside.
How you doing?
And at East Jersey, troubled teens embark on the ultimate field trip, a one-of-a-kind program popularly known as Scared Straight.
This is reality today, man. I'm not no police, I'm a convict. I messed up my life. I'm trying to encourage you not to make the same mistake in which I made, man, and stop taking life like a joke.
The story of East Jersey State Prison begins in the 1890s. Its planners had called for a new kind of institution that was less rigid than a traditional penitentiary. Its mission was to house young first-time offenders convicted of petty crimes, men who the state believed could be reformed. The site chosen was an 85-acre parcel of state land in rural New Jersey known as the Edgar Farm. Work began in 1896, and the cornerstone was laid at what was to be known then as the New Jersey State Reformatory. The initial design called for a grand rotunda that would serve as the hub for cell blocks that would radiate out like the spokes of a wheel. Such a floor plan had become the standard of earlier 19th century American prisons because it provided a convenient viewing area to keep watch on the entire institution. The building was also meant to make a psychological statement.
This menacing structure is intended to convey power to those inside. It's also to convey power and security to those outside. So those of us on the outside are expected to look at it and feel safe. And I think that was part of its symbolism.
On August 5th, 1901, with construction still underway, the first young prisoners were marched through the entrance at the New Jersey Reformatory. Most had committed crimes that involved what New Jersey's leaders called moral turpitude. From newly discovered prison records, Sergeant Tim Clark has pieced together a picture of who they were.
An average inmate of roughly 19 to 21 years of age. Some of the crimes that were committed was petty larceny, where they were convicted and sentenced to 2.5 to 5 years for robbing $25 to $40.
Harry Sisko had pled guilty to stealing $27 from his boss's desk. Joseph Dunn would serve 10 months for petty larceny and breaking and entering. he was 19 years old. James Thatcher had robbed a man at a racetrack in Warren County. William Quinn was sent here for the possession of burglar tools. Upon arrival, each young man reported to the chief clerk's office, where he recounted his crime in his own words and made a statement as to his religion. In the prison storeroom, the staff waited to issue the new inmate a uniform and sent him off with a regulation haircut. The next stop was the Bertillon room. It was here that prisoners were subjected to an arcane science of identification called the Bertillon system. Developed in 1880 by a French anthropologist, the technique was used to catalog the exact dimensions of the body. The width of the skull, the length of each foot, even the size of ears and fingers were carefully noted and recorded onto the inmate's Bertillon card for later identification. In succeeding years, the same room was used to collect inmate fingerprints, a method that was far more accurate and less time-consuming. Although the prison was designed to resemble a spoked wheel, the first inmates were greeted by only one spoke, the original cell block called One Wing. Built of stone, cement, and steel, its cells are stacked 4 stories high and seen to stretch on forever. Iron bars secured each cell. Inside, the lack of sunlight and the cramped quarters sent a message of incarceration, not redemption. The cell block has remained in constant use since it opened in 1901 and looks much as it did 100 years ago. There is still no hot water, and each jail door still locks a single man in a stone cell. By 1905, overcrowding had become the biggest concern at the reformatory. There was not sufficient plumbing to allow for regular bathing. At night, 150 men slept in the corridor outside the cells. And while plans had been made to conduct trade schools at the institution, there were only a few sheds available to hold classes. And so, for the first inmates at the New Jersey Reformatory, reform looked a lot like prison. New Jersey's University of Another Chance. That is what officials called East Jersey State Prison in 1912. Although not up to the academic standards of the state's other universities like Princeton and Rutgers, it offered discipline and opportunity for young men whose prior education had been at the School of Hard Knocks. Men like James Cartwell, 19, sent here after an arrest for burglary. He and 500 other young men found themselves locked up in an imposing fortress that was half school and half steel cage. Each was to stay here only long enough to be reformed. Dr. Frank Moore, a former minister and boys' school headmaster, took over as the warden in 1909. Under Warden Moore, a strict curriculum was enforced. Each weekday began under the prison's impressive Romanesque dome with an hour in the drill hall.
One of the oldest buildings in the institution contains the drill hall. Back in the early years of the institution, back to when it was a reformatory and also a state prison farm, the drill hall was used, and the name was derived from what they actually did up there, is they drilled the inmates in sort of a paramilitary fashion. Weather permitting,
200 inmates at a time marched outside on the prison field. Their music and battalion formations had been adopted from the War Department. Such activity was believed to improve self-esteem and force slouching inmates into the habit of standing up straight. Twice a year, during a public display, the prison drill team capped off the exercises with a blast from a war surplus artillery piece. 50 years later, Frank Killane arrived as a prison guard. Although much had changed, the music remained.
We had an inmate band who played outside. It was marching music, like band music. He played to go to work. The band played when they went out to the yard. It was something different, and the inmates had to march to the music.
By 1912, a series of improvements was underway that would relieve crowding and provide space for education and vocational training. The most striking addition was a second wing built with inmate labor that radiated out from the prison's central rotunda.
When the prison first opened, it looked like a wheel with one spoke. As time progressed, forewing was added to the institution, so now the prison basically looked like a wheel with two spokes.
The second spoke was called forewing. Its stone shell was fitted with individual steel walls that would form tiny one-man cells. While such cages might play a useful role in a maximum security prison, they were a curious feature for a boys' reform school. Still, in the reformatory's early years, a proud effort was made to educate and rehabilitate. Inmates spent half of each day learning a trade which might benefit them upon their release. There was a house painting class that met in a shed behind the kitchen. The students practiced by painting prison bars. At another shop, inmates were taught to repair and manufacture shoes. In a masonry class conducted on the yard, they learned how to lay bricks and pour cement. They also helped to build the prison wall, another somewhat peculiar feature for a boys' reform school. It is 25 feet high and 3,300 feet long. It contains nearly 7,000 tons of concrete and extends 20 feet below the ground.
It sends a message that we don't want people on the outside to see the people on the inside. They're very separated from us. Big, high walls. Symbolic. More symbolic than functional.
Back inside, the decorative leather shop gave inmates hands-on experience in another useful trade that could lead to gainful employment. Their products included chair seats, saddles, belts, and harnesses. Not to be outdone, each year's steam fitting class turned out champion examples of plumbing and heating work. Since many of the prisoners were unable to read and write, the reformatory's classrooms were planned to give each young man a minimum of an 8th grade education before he left. Within 2 years of their arrival, most inmates were judged to have been redeemed, and they were granted parole.
I don't know that there's really a lot of evidence to support that this, redemption through work was really effective. For one thing, they grew a couple of years older, and everybody matures in a few years, so when they came out, many of them went straight. I don't know that there's any evidence that would let us to believe that it was this experience behind these walls that did it.
But over the years, New Jersey sent an increasing number of young criminals to the reformatory to serve longer and longer sentences. James Yambrick, age 18, was a convicted car thief serving 7 years. Richard Kiefer was given 5 years for a crime listed as open lewdness. Isaac Daniels had 7 years for robbery. By 1940, 2 more stone wings radiated from the prison's hub to house a population that had grown to nearly 1,000, most of them young, first-time offenders. Reform school life continued with the addition of a prison farm where trustees were permitted to work outside the wall. Then, in 1948, with all the spokes of its wheel in place, the reformatory came of age. In just half a century, it had become a maximum security prison. Younger inmates were transferred to a prison farm 35 miles away, and a new breed of inmates soon arrived. Hardened criminals, desperate men with long sentences for the most violent offenses: rape, armed robbery, murder. All would be housed inside the giant stone fortress. Everything would change as the stage was set for mayhem, destruction, and death. Even the prison's name would be changed to Rahway. Hard criminals, hard time, savage behavior.
People remember this as a reformatory. This is not. This is a maximum security prison. We have people doing maximum time from 40 years to hundreds of years. And they do get out of hand, and they do work. They do go after each other, and they do go after staff.
These are the stark realities of East Jersey State Prison. They are contained inside an aging labyrinth of corridors, passageways, and cages.
It was supposed to reform wayward juveniles where they would work and find penance and be alone with their conscience.
But in 1948, the state moved the wayward young men out, moved hardened criminals in, and changed the name. It was a name that would reverberate with violence and mayhem far into the future, a name that stuck: Rahway.
Rahway, when we still call it Rahway, is a 19th century fortress prison, unique to America actually, with the central pivot and the tiers and the towers. But today it's not really very efficient by modern standards. It does present some security problems. It's conducive to riot. It's not an easy prison to control.
April 17th, 1952, 4 years after the shift to maximum security, Rahway Prison exploded in a riot. The inmates claimed they were retaliating over poor living conditions and beatings by prison guards. 231 defiant prisoners ravaged their cell wing, leaving a trail of debris and destruction in their wake. Guards were taken hostage. It was the most extreme display of anger the prison had ever seen. By the third day of the siege, inmates begging for water punctured radiator pipes in an attempt to get a few rusty drops to drink. On the 5th day of the standoff, Warden R. William Legay announced that the prisoners had been gassed and the riot was over. Guards who had been held hostage were released unharmed, and Rahway State Prison faced the task of mopping up after its first inmate uprising. The violence did not end there. It remains a constant threat to the prison staff.
We had officers stabbed, officers assaulted. Goes on, you never know what's going to happen.
Frank Killane recalls a fellow officer who became the target of an inmate.
For some reason, the officer must have said something to him. He turned around, slashed his throat. He had a toothbrush with a razor attached to the end of the toothbrush. That officer still works here, but he was cut from ear to ear.
Officials routinely find homemade knives, daggers, and other deadly implements hidden in the prison complex.
What we have here is a piece of a clipboard. They broke it off, And what they do is wrap the tape around in reverse, so when you cut somebody's, say, jugular vein, so to say, and they start bleeding, it doesn't slip out of your hand.
In 1997, after a New Jersey corrections officer at another prison was stabbed to death by an inmate with a homemade weapon, the state issued a grim safety mandate to its prison guards.
All of the correctional staff are required to wear stab-resistant vests to protect them from shanks, knives, and other sharp instruments that inmates invariably are going to find somewhere within the institution. Things that you and I would take for granted, like a toothbrush, can be sharpened and used as an implement against the staff or against other inmates.
The vests are mandatory equipment, and each day begins with prison staff donning their armor before they report for work.
What we have here is a paint roller. The guy got tired of making $1.60 a day, so he broke the end of it off, sharpened it up. Be able to work with this. I want to be one of the first ones to test out if these vests work.
There are gruesome weapons made inside these walls that defy even the stab-proof vests.
It's probably the most formidable and dangerous weapon that we've come across. What it is a piece of razor wire with cloth wrapped around it and then tape to hold it in place. You walk up behind somebody like a garrote, and you decapitate him. His head will be sitting in your lap.
Although violence against the prison staff results in occasional tragedy, such episodes are far outnumbered by inmate-on-inmate attacks. Alan August spent 26 years as a guard here before retiring in 1995. He recalls the brutal death of an inmate in Four Wing.
This inmate had a picture of a female friend of his on his little desk in his cell. One of the other inmates who was walking past wanted that picture, and he stole it. And a couple of days later, the inmate walked past the inmate's cell that stole the picture, and he waited for him, and he stabbed him. I think it was like 14 times. And let me tell you, when you die in a prison, it's not like everybody runs to assist you, right? While he was laying on the floor dying, they stepped over his body, went into his cell, and they stole his property, whatever he had in there.
The 1960s brought the prison one of its most celebrated inmates, Reuben Hurricane Carter. In 1966, Carter was the #1 contender for the professional middleweight boxing crown. His fast and furious style had earned him the nickname Hurricane. That year, he was wrongfully arrested for a triple murder in which 2 men and a woman were shot at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey.
Reuben Hurricane Carter was sentenced to here at Rahway, and he did his time here. He was a good inmate. He was good to the staff. He didn't cause any trouble.
Facing 3 life terms, Carter steadfastly maintained his innocence. While in prison, he wrote his autobiography, The 16th Round, which inspired public figures like Bob Dylan and Muhammad Ali to work to free him. There were rallies proclaiming his innocence and a public outcry for his release. But in Rahway, the story of the Hurricane would come to include the prison's 3 darkest days, the riot of 1971.
The only thing I could think of with the canisters of tear gas going off that I might not see the next daylight.
November 24th, 1971, Rahway State Prison, the night before Thanksgiving. From the outside, there were no signs of unrest. Inside, about 200 inmates had assembled in the auditorium. One moment it was movie night, the next it was chaos.
One of the inmates was drunk on homemade hooch, that's prison liquor, and he came up in the auditorium and he took a wooden chair And during the showing of the movie, he threw the wooden chair through the screen.
Fighting erupted in the darkened auditorium. More chairs were hurled. A piano was pushed off the stage. Superintendent Samuel Vuksevich was alerted to the disturbance and entered the tumult alone, unaccompanied by any of the guards.
He went in and talked to the inmate. He was on the stage, and the inmate went off on him. Started hitting him, threw him off the stage. At that time, the whole place blew up.
A metal security door was all that stood between the mob and the rest of the prison.
They actually used enough force to tear the metal door off its hinges, and they threw it down the stairway.
Rampaging inmates rushed out into cell wings number 1 and 4, taking the superintendent along as a hostage.
Officers tried to get in to help the superintendent. They were taken. They were beat bad, and the inmates now had control of those 2 major wings, which were the 2 biggest wings in the place.
Anthony Piscatelli was the only guard in 3 Wing when the wave of inmates came his way.
As they shut my access off to get outside, I couldn't get out here any longer. There was too many inmates out here that were looking for hostages.
Officer Piscatelli was trapped in his cell block by rioting inmates who had by now taken 8 hostages.
They were all hurt. Officers were stabbed. Superintendent was stabbed. He was beat bad.
It looked like a chilling replay of the riot that had engulfed Attica Prison in New York 2 months earlier. State troopers had ended that disturbance in a bloodbath.
Attica was in my head. I realized every prison was a hot box, and it was a scary feeling, but it was to a point of, was I going to see my wife again? Was I going to be home for the holidays?
As Piscatelli's situation grew hopeless, Reuben Hurricane Carter, the middleweight boxer jailed here on murder charges, emerged from the mob.
Reuben Carter came in the wing with a group of inmates. He stopped them from accosting me and taking my keys, and that's when I ended up in the bathroom. You're going to fight for so long. He then pushed his desk in front of this door and stayed here for most of the day.
From the bathroom that served as his safe haven, Piscatelli waited and listened and hoped. The standoff continued overnight. The lives of the hostages hung in the balance as the inmates demanded to negotiate for better living conditions and media coverage of their situation.
Come on, back it up. Keep the driveway, man.
UPI and AP had sent somebody here, but they wanted a black reporter. And my boss looked up and said, Stan, get down the roadway.
Journalist Stanley Terrell found himself spending Thanksgiving at a prison riot.
First thing that greeted me when I walked inside those doors, the fences weren't there then, were the state troopers milling around. And you could see, you could hear the inmates shouting and you know, all kinds of noise and hoops and hollers, and you know, there were remnants of smoke in the air from where they were burning sheets and mattresses.
Inmates and officials alike soon realized it was a no-win situation.
Everybody had Attica in the back of their mind, I mean, because that had only been a month or so before that. I guess they figured when they talked to the press and could get their grievances out into the public, that kind of appeased them.
In other words, the inmates are agreeing to go back into their cells now?
Right. Well, they're going to be accompanied by community people to make sure that there's no reprisals by guards.
Finally, 3 days after the riot had begun, negotiators assured the inmates they would not be harmed and that their conditions would improve. They returned to their cells and the hostages were released. Some had been seriously injured.
None of the hostages ever came back to work. I mean, they were brutally beaten, and they never came back to Rahway Prison. That was the last time they ever stepped foot in this place.
Despite his heroics, Reuben Hurricane Carter remained in prison another 14 years. 1985, New Jersey's Supreme Court found that the evidence used to convict Carter was fabricated and false. After a total of 19 years behind bars, the Hurricane was set free. In 1988, the prison's name was changed again, this time after an extended campaign by the residents of the city of Rahway. They claimed that being identified with the prison stigmatized the city and adversely affected their property values. Officially, Rahway became East Jersey State Prison. Even with the new name, it still drives inmates to desperation. James Phillips has been here 20 years for bank robbery.
I always say if you can make it the first night, you can do 30 years. The first night is hell. Like, you know, most people, they commit suicide or try to kill themselves when they at their first night. That's the hardest part.
Attempts by prisoners to hang themselves occur often here. The guards carry a tool designed to cut them down.
This is a cut-down tool that we use for people who are trying to hang. As you can see, it has a round bull nose, has a sharp edge. Every officer has one, and it'll cut mostly anything that they have to do this with, bed sheets or wire or light cord, whatever they make to do themselves. You find people that'll hang in the cell, and different wings I've worked, you'll go to that area and these guys are hanging. They're sick of life, and they do what they do.
Among inmates, there is a palpable sense of danger.
Well, the dangers is you can easily lose your life, you know what I'm saying? At blinkling of an eye, you know what I mean? The dangers is getting, ill and perhaps not being attended to medically.
Crowded conditions in the prison today have forced officials to house certain lower-risk inmates in portable shelters that serve as dormitories. And to maintain order, comforts granted after the 1971 riot are slowly eroding.
We've clamped down on the introduction of drugs and other illicit substances into the institution. We took away food packages. We took away civilian clothing. All of the inmates now wear uniforms.
Access to visitors has also been reduced.
Well, now it's kind of hardship now because the way they changed the business, they used to have them on Saturday and Sunday. Now they change the business at night, and it's hard for a lot of people to come at night,
A boxing program once allowed prisoners to compete against professional fighters in the drill hall. In 1979, inmate James Scott defeated a series of highly ranked light heavyweight boxers. The matches were nationally televised from inside the prison.
It was good for the morale of the inmates in the prison because it kept their minds off the monotonous daily routine that goes on in a prison setting, and it gave them somebody to cheer for, one of their own. I think it was a good thing.
But the boxing program has also been curtailed.
Basically, nowadays, the mission of the prison system has strayed away from rehabilitation and is strictly, maintainedly just keeping the inmate locked up.
It's rather harsh oftentimes, but it's something that you gotta more or less adapt to. You know what I'm saying? Adapt to your surroundings or whatever. And even though I've been here 19 years, it hasn't been a piece of cake. You know what I'm saying? Each and every day's been a struggle,
Riots, assault, murder. All were summed up in one word: Rahway. Until the city managed to have the prison's name changed to East Jersey State. Still, the institution can look beyond its legacy of violence and point to the worthy contributions it has made to society and popular culture. In 1973, the prison introduced America to the escorts.
The escorts were 7 guys, started at Trent State Prison, wound up here, and they formed a singing group. And they were discovered by a guy who worked for Motown named George Kerr, who wanted to record them. And he somehow talked prison officials into allowing him to do that.
It was the first time a pop music album had ever been recorded in a maximum security prison.
I know that it has a certain fascination, and perhaps part of that fascination is the fact that it's performing behind prison walls. Now, you know, you look at these prison walls, it conveys a sense of excitement, a foreboding, there's a certain charisma attached to it, and perhaps that, you know, that charisma attaches to the singing group.
The escorts derived their name from the fact that an inmate must be accompanied by an escort whenever he moves outside his cell block. Producer George Kerr introduced the white-shirted members of the singing group at a press conference held inside the prison. Their album received extensive radio play and sold over 100,000 copies. Proceeds went to the inmates' families and their lawyers, as well as to improve inmate facilities at the prison. In 1976, another group of convicts embarked on a program that would define the prison far into the future and form a link with its past. Although the prison has not sought to reform wayward youth in over 50 years, these teens have come to East Jersey State Prison for just that reason. They have embarked on the ultimate field trip, a visit with a group of life-term inmates who hope to turn the kids away from crime.
I would not say I was a bad kid, I made a bad decision. And that's the same thing we try to tell the kids in the Scared Straight program. You're not bad kids, you're making bad choices.
Once a day, a group of children with juvenile offenses in their past, or those deemed at risk for it in the future, form a line to get into the prison.
Let's go, you, move it out. All you guys got them hoodies on, take them shits off.
As they file through the entrance, they come face to face with the reality of prison life.
Don't come in here gritty. Pull your pants up.
They are going to spend the morning at the Juvenile Awareness Program, a program popularized in the Academy Award-winning documentary, Scared Straight. The film startled the nation with scenes of children getting the lesson of their lives, face to face with hardened criminals.
I'm here for murder, kidnapping, robbery, armed robbery, conspiracy, breaking the dude's jaw, and breaking his woman both her damn arms.
We just wanted to make these kids aware of where their life was headed and what kind of life you lead in a prison setting.
Alan August helped the Lifers start the program 24 years ago.
Usually it was around 30 to 40 inmates. These are inmates doing life sentences, the majority of them for homicide.
Now, you want to impress these bitches how tough you are?
They would be confronted in brutal street language by the convicts.
I don't understand.
Explaining how they ended up in prison and what their earlier life was like.
I ain't met anybody yet that planned to come to prison.
This is reality today, man. This ain't no, I'm not no police, I'm a convict. I messed up my life. I'm trying to encourage you not to make the same mistake in which I made, man.
The program continues today with the leadership of inmates Calvin Bass and Kevin Stout, who are both serving life sentences.
What we do is we just get ready to go and tell them, you know what I'm saying, if they don't cut out the bullshit that they're doing, what they're going to wind up being in prison, or they going to have, you know, are they going to be dead, either one.
There's a bunch of them up there, so maybe we can reach about 10 or 15 of them this moment, you know?
Inside the prison's auditorium, a scene unfolds that has played itself out on a daily basis for 24 years.
It don't take no five motherfuckers to rape one of you punk motherfuckers. That's it.
The concept is not necessarily to scare an individual, but it's to like wake him up to his own reality, show him the consequences of the wrongdoings by any means necessary. So a lot of times we use like profane language, which is the language of the street or the language that they're perhaps used to.
After 24 years, the lifers in the Juvenile Awareness Program at East Jersey can look back on mixed results.
I myself came through the Scared Straight program something like 22 years ago, so I'm one of the ones that didn't listen, you know what I'm saying?
That there's probably 200 or 300 a year that are genuinely turned around. They've had 50,000 kids go through, and many of them have gone straight, but most kids go straight anyway, you see, and that's what you have to consider.
Many years have passed since East Jersey State Prison was called the University of Another Chance. From the day young men sent here were taught to stand up straight and repent for their petty crimes.
Now this facility, like so many others throughout the country, has been retrofitted to become an institution to house the extremely violent individuals who have committed offenses like multiple murders. And that's what you have now housed in a facility that was designed for incorrigible juveniles.
Once hailed as a house of refuge, for many, it has become a house of horrors.
What it intended to be and what it became probably is part of the story of America. This is a very harsh country. This is a very severe country. We're very hard on people who break the law. We come down on them very hard. I mean, just by looking at that structure, you can see America's attitude toward deviance and crime.
Weary and outmoded, the future of East Jersey State Prison is unclear.
I once heard a very wise man say, a prison's just like any other building. One day it's going to be torn down. So there isn't any future for this place.
At present, East Jersey incarcerates 2,300 inmates. 550 are serving 20 years or more, 165 for life.
You've got a architectural and a programmatic design that's 100 years old. In fact, this facility is slated to be replaced in the not-too-distant future.
What replaces East Jersey State Prison will be founded on efficiency and the need to house growing numbers of convicted criminals in less space. What will be lost is a monument long ago founded on humanity and good intentions. A prison that once promised another chance.